piacere enorme essere qua, da fiorentino che abita e lavora all'estero da più o meno 30 anni, fare una presentazione in questa bellissima sala è un grandissimo onore e piacere. Quindi ringrazio molto MUS.E Firenze per aver organizzato questo incontro, questa giornata di lavori affascinanti, e anche per dare seguito al lavoro che abbiamo fatto appunto anche noi alla National University of Ireland Galway da qualche anno a questa parte. Infatti abbiamo avuto l'onore e il piacere di avere Valentina Zucchi a Galway nel 2017 e Francesco Gori a Galway nel 2018 proprio per presentare l'esperienza di MUS.E in Irlanda e di quello che sta facendo la città di Firenze per promuovere il patrimonio artistico fiorentino in un contesto appunto di transculturalità, di ormai società globale in cui probabilmente, possibilmente, la promozione, la diffusione del patrimonio artistico può essere anche visto in maniera diversa da quello che è stato fatto tradizionalmente. L'intervento di Tom Mitchell è stato, secondo me, illuminante, e anche perché mi ha dato la possibilità di riflettere molto su quello che vorrei fare io. Come il professor Mitchell, anche io non faccio parte del mondo museale, sono uno studioso che si forma prima di tutto in italianistica qui a Firenze con Giorgio Luti, e che poi dopo ha percorso una sua traiettoria particolare, continuando il mio lavoro in letteratura, anche se poi passando un po' più alla letteratura comparata, e poi ultimamente anche avventurandomi in percorsi diversi, quali il Cultural Studies. Quindi anche io mi associo più all'elemento società, ma la mia è una società un po' particolare. Io sono un particular specimen, let's say, of society, visto che abito tra culture, tra lingue, ormai lo faccio da tantissimi anni, e quindi sono un ibrido. I'm an hybrid myself, perhaps a monstrous hybrid, I'm not sure, but definitely we inhabit some strange kind of location as people who move, who travel around, and that's the reason why I've decided also to present this talk in English, because it's part of my identity. I'm in between Italian and English, I'm in between Ireland and before Australia and Italy, so I'm made of different parts. If that's being monstrous, that's perhaps an interesting way of being monstrous. Professor Mitchell indicated that monsters are not necessarily ugly or scary, and I hope I'm not that kind of monster if I am one. But the reason why I am insisting on this notion of ability in-betweenness in relation to our discussion today is because what I perceive as happening in Florence for quite a while now, let's say since 2014, where you have a very kind of courageous comune, giunta, together with MUS.E Firenze, who is trying to do something a little bit different. I promote the Renaissance art of Florence in conjunction with contemporary culture, and not only within museums. And that's what I'm interested more, perhaps. So that's the reason why it's more about society than museums. Although the city of Florence itself is a museum. So it doesn't matter where you have an exhibition taking place in Palazzo Medici Riccardi, or the Uffizi, or Palazzo Strozzi, or Forte Belvedere. You have also something happening within the open spaces of the city. And Piazza Signoria is one of them, and is one of the most iconic spaces in Florence. It's open, it's public, you can walk, you don't have to pay a ticket to get in, you just happen to be there. And within this particular context, works of important artists, important contemporary artists, Jeff Koons, Jan Fabre, Urs Fischer, have been displayed, creating very interesting kind of dynamic within the city of Florence. So I would like to show you some of these. You are very familiar with some of these works. This is Jeff Koons, Pluto and Proserpina, which was exhibited in Piazza della Signoria on Berengaria, I think in 2015, 2016. Okay, that's another perspective. I mean, these are, so to speak, intervention which, to a certain extent, link or connect with my presence as hybrid, because you have an hybrid space, an hybrid time. You have the Renaissance, you have the cradle of the Renaissance, Piazza della Signoria, recognized as one of the most important stages through which present and perform the Renaissance. So you have the copy, but still the Michelangelo's David, you have Donatello, Judith Oliphant, you have Giambologna, Rattole Sabine in the Loggia dell'Anzi. So there are very representative works that stand for the Renaissance, and all of a sudden this space has been kind of infiltrated, Ecke Schmidt referred to in positive ways, or penetrati, as Achille Bonito Oliva also referred to this particular operazioni culturali. So these spaces are infiltrated by something which is not really Renaissance, although it may dialogue with the Renaissance. In Jeff Koons, for instance, there is a clear and deliberate homage to Bernini. It's not Renaissance, it's early Baroque, 1620, Pluto's Proserpina. But still, there is an interesting juxtaposition between the Bernini and Jeff Koons. But definitely there is a dialogue, but also an estrangement. Here you have other possible homages. You have Bernini, but you have also the serpentine figure of Giambologna's the Ratto delle Sabine, and you have also possible kind of model in Michelangelo il Genio della Vittoria. So there is a definite dialogue, definite encounter. So when Jeff Koons was invited to exhibit in Piazza della Signoria, he had in mind a series of iconic works of the Renaissance, of early Baroque, and he wanted to enter into a dialogue by presenting something that resembled them. Then you have Jan Fabre, Searching for Utopia. This is 2016, this giant turtle. And on top of the giant turtle, there is a self-portrait of the artist, Jan Fabre, again against the background of La Fontana di Nettuno on this occasion. And then you have, of course, AOA, this is La Fondazione Palazzo Strozzi, still Florence, a very important palace of the Renaissance, which in this instance is kind of decorated with rubber boats, orange colored, and it's something not congruous with the actual palace itself. So you have, like myself, some sort of hybridity. So you have some sort of kind of monsters, and these monsters are doing something rather, well, unique, let's say. And then this perhaps I think the latest one, I don't think there has been any other intervention since 2007. It was Fischer's Big Clay. That's some images. And what happens there? Okay. Let's leave it there. So when I was thinking of presenting this talk, I was reflecting, and there is an element of autoethnography in what I'm doing, to the sense that I'm also kind of projecting myself into the way in which I approach the study and reflection of these curatorial experiences in Florence, and respond to the way in which the general public, stakeholders, critics have also responded to what has happened in Piazza della Signoria recently, at least from 2014 up until 2017. And also the way in which the artistic kind of heritage is promoted. This is an interesting way of doing it, let's say. Why? Why does the city of Florence decides to do something like this in your face, so to speak, rather than conserving and presenting the Renaissance in the traditional way, just leaving the Renaissance alone, without the kind of togetherness or the interference of other works. Does it pay? Does it work? What does it do, actually? So in this context, I've been thinking about memory, translation, and the way in which curatorial experiences such as these engage the notion of the past. What do we do with the past? How we present the past to the present, and what we do with memory. In a sense, memory, not too differently from translation, can conserve, and we have seen this morning, Professor Clemente has made a very articulate presentation about the significance of conserving or conserving a particular patterning that is about to expire or to disappear. So memory can be conserved through a series of interventions that tends to focus on a particular period, on a particular moment, and present that moment in its integrity. And there is nothing better than Florence to do that, to a certain extent, because Florence is considered a cradle of the Renaissance. So Piazza Signoria is a symbol, is a cipher, if you want, is an emblem of this integrity, authenticity, and also authority. So there is an element of power as well, which is embedded in the notion of Florence and Piazza della Signoria as a stage. Memory can also transform by doing something that is a little bit different, similar to translation. Because in translation too, you can do something which is particular according to the strategies that you use to approach translation. This is another interesting experience that took place in the Mercato Centrale in Florence. This is, I think, in 2015, when a copy of the Michelangelo's David, life-size copy of Michelangelo's David, was placed in the Mercato Centrale. But as you see, this David is a particular one, is a tattoo, this is a tattoo maculated David, and the presence of that statue in the Mercato Centrale again created quite a little bit of controversies. So I think a German linguist, and back in 1813, made an interesting observation about translation. This is Friedrich Schleiermacher, who virtually said a translator can do two things. One thing is to leave the audience at home and move the author, or leave the author at home and invite the audience abroad. So in the second case, you have foreignization, and in the former case, you have domestication. So it really depends on the strategy of the translator. It is the interpreter he or she who decide how to go about translating stuff. I think something similar might take place in the mind of curators when they think about, well, how am I going about the artistic heritage of my city, my place, my country? What do I do? Do I conserve, therefore remain kind of faithful to the letter, don't do anything, I translate ad verbum, or shall I do something a little bit different, especially because we live in a different context? There is a tendency towards transnationalization, transculturalization, globalization, and therefore a moment of opening that might actually introduce different kind of idiom, different kind of languages, different kind of ways of looking at the way in which even a locality can present itself to itself, not only to the world outside, but also to itself. One of them would be to do a little bit of kind of, how could I say, to make an intervention that will introduce some anomalies in the way in which you present it. And this is the way of foreignization, I would say. So if we take that as a kind of point of reference and a model, and we find relations between translation and memorization, then, well, we understand that perhaps there are different ways. There is not only one way of looking at the diffusion, the promotion of artistic heritage. There is another element which I think is also important when we think about artistic exposure more than kind of evaluation. In fact, I'm not really going to enter into the debate. I'm not really interested in the debate about the kind of relationship that contemporary art established with the Renaissance. In other words, does it work or it doesn't work according to aesthetic element? It doesn't work because it's incongruous, because the work of contemporary art is not as good as the work of Renaissance artists. So I'm not interested in entering into a debate which validate or non-validate the work of artistic creation. I don't think that's a very fruitful way of doing it. But I think it's way of a perception, the way in which we respond to this kind of event that interests me. And so how do we go about reading art? How do we go about interpreting and witnessing art? I think there are different ways in which we can do that. One is historicizing. Therefore, we look at it according to particular periods. And this is one way that museums have usually organized the works that they present. They present according to periods. So you have the Renaissance, you have the medieval, you have the Baroque, the Rococo, and so on and so forth. And you keep them separate. So the itinerary is organized according to periods, to time, which don't actually mix together because you have to maintain the integrity of that particular moment. There is also another approach, which is the ethnographic approach, which actually goes the other way around. Instead of promoting and emphasizing time, it promotes and emphasizes space, so the kind of authority, originality of the space where it is produced, that particular work, the city, the region. In this case, we have the Florentine Renaissance, which is different from the Renaissance in Naples, in Venice, in Rome. There is a particularity about the locality in which you work, in which your creative process develops. And then there is another perspectives. There is the nomadic one. Again, space now takes over time and temporality, so we are far away from historicizing. What the nomadic perception or angle perspective does is to jettison the kind of locality, the kind of originality of the place, and emphasize movements, transitions, encounters, and how that work. As you understand, to a certain extent, I'm more kind of prone to look at the nomadic approach rather than the two others in relation to a perception and experience, and also in relation to presentations. But there is something else which I think is of significance and which I'm interested in developing. I think Tom Mitchell has already alluded to objects and the way in which they, coming together, they organize a community of things. Bruno Latour, for instance, has spoken about the assembly of object, of things, and the power, this political power that this can have. I think that they could also have a very important aesthetic impact. So to me, it's not really so much important to read Jeff Koons in relation to Donatello, in relation to Michelangelo, or Jan Fabre in relation to La Fontana Nettuno, or to the equestrian statue of Cosimo I de' Medici. It's about seeing them as part of a unique stage, as things coming together as one. So I have a kind of synthetic view of the square, like on a screen. And instead of separating them, bringing them together and look at what they do. So they're kind of monsters in a sense, but speaking a language that is different to the language that we are kind of used to. And what does this new language of assemblage? I call it the cumulative image. The cumulative image is coming together and just, it's there to us, to shock, to put ourselves outside of our comfort zone, because that seems exactly what has happened in Florence. And many Florentines, and only Florentines, have reacted against these interventions because they feel that they desacralized, the kind of deface the space of Piazza della Signoria, which is considered sacred in the context of the presentation of the Renaissance according to a particular way of presenting the Renaissance, according to a particular way of living the Renaissance. So this is not considered proper. So there has been a kind of reaction, a negative reaction. There is also those who are kind of saying, well, this is interesting because it's renewing our way of looking at it. And I think that's a positive element too. People like myself, for instance, who come back to Florence on a regular basis, and sometimes are kind of interested in seeing places which are different to what we remember. Our memory is triggered in a way that is totally new. And so we perhaps pause a moment longer and take stock of what's in front of us, something that perhaps we wouldn't have done if that particular otherness wasn't there. So that's an element which I think is very interesting, it's very useful to look at. But perhaps there is something more to that. And I'm quoting Tom Mitchell here in this instance because I think it's important what he writes and does in relation to the promotion of culture and art, and especially in the context of, well, I would say public spaces, but we know the museums are public, even if they're closed. By open spaces, perhaps does a little bit more justice to what I'm talking about, because we are in squares, we are in streets, via Strozzi, for Palazzo Strozzi, in Piazza della Signoria, so we are in kind of open spaces. The potential for progression and even violence grows exponentially as soon as art enters the public sphere. And I think that's a very interesting remark, and that's precisely what has happened in Florence since 2014, that many perceive this intervention as a violence to the patrimony, to the heritage of Florence, as a reflection of violence to themselves directly, because they're kind of the bearer of that heritage, which is something that creates and forms the identity, being a Florentine, what it means to being a Florentine today. Very much the important and significant of the Renaissance. So we look at ourselves today as if we were kind of made of something that doesn't belong to today anymore. It belonged to the 14th or the 15th century. And this kind of confrontation can have a very kind of negative reaction. And in What Do Pictures Want, 2005, and here I'm paraphrasing Mitchell, I'm not quoting directly from the book, but Mitchell says that people are entitled not to have offensive images thrust in their faces, but they are also entitled to look at images that others might consider offensive. So there is no way of knowing what's going to be offensive and what's not going to be offensive. So that's why you have this kind of division when confronted with exhibitions or curatorial experiences that have taken place in Florence. There are those who favor them, there are those who go against them. What's interesting to me, though, that is in relation to the kind of criticism which is embedded within aesthetic kind of parameters, so you read it as a lack of congruity and harmony. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because there are two modes of artistic production which don't have much to do. So there is no connection. Although all the artists were invited in Florence, Jeff Koons, Jan Fabre, Urs Fischer, and so on, really made an effort or were kind of explicit about the possible dialogue that they might have or were hoping to have with the Renaissance culture. So there was a deliberate kind of attempt, and that attempt wasn't, according to many, successful. So why doesn't it work? According to kind of aesthetic reasons. Why it works? It works because it provokes a new kind of relation with the city. It works because these artists are important, are considered the most important artists internationally. So their pedigree is an assurance that what you're doing is fine, is correct. But again, this element of kind of reinforcement through pedigree or to artistic credibility and reputation, I think it's still kind of traditional to a certain extent, tries to go back to validation that is based on traditional parameters. What I'm interested in is something else, and this is something that goes back to the notion of sacralization and the importance of spaces and their kind of element and the aura that was actually discussed before. Here we have two Italian philosophers, Tonino Gruffero, who has written a very interesting book in 2010, Atmosferologia, Estetica degli Spazi, in which he talks about a particular genius loci of a place. And Piazza Signoria, believe me or not, has a very strong element of this genius loci. It is the place of the Italian Renaissance. And that stage is speaking every day to millions of people coming from all over the world to experience that. Apparently there are 12 million people visiting Florence every year. And the reason why they do that, perhaps, is to experience, to a certain extent, this genius loci. And so there is an element of sacralization of the sacred. What do you do about these spaces? How do you manage them? And Giovanni Ferraro, in Libro dei Luoghi, has talked about contemporary kind of tendency to desacralize, to deface the sacred. okay? What interests me is, as I said, the combination, the creation of a new language. So to me, it's not a matter of defending something or criticizing something because they respond or don't respond to particular kind of criteria based on traditional way of looking, experiencing art, but to me they actually introduce a new language, an event that touches you kind of personally, emotionally, and the creation of this event and this creation of a new language of cumulative and assemblage, which I find extremely instructive and invigorating, and I think there is much more to say about this, it's a language that perhaps one has to learn to read and understand in order to make sense of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paolo. I think it has been really astonishing. I mean, seeing how museums can really go outside, and especially your thought about our places from a foreign and domestic point of view, we could say. I'm speaking English just in honor of our two professors which come from abroad. And I would like just to point out 4 words that really we can keep in mind, I think, us from the museum community as we are. We are talking about museums and society. We thank Mitchell for recording to us the difference between society and community. I think working in museums, we really feel as a community, working for same goals, working from same passions, and doing in a way, though in different places, the same road, in different ways. And today we really tried to focus on museums, those monsters. As previously was said, museums are monsters in really their etymology, so this vox media, which can really be astonishing and beautifully shocking, but also fearing. And we work in these really hybrid and fantastic and monstrous places, trying to do our best. And then society, which is outside our places, but which want to come inside, which we want them to come inside, and which we want to talk to, even going outside. Both Pietro Clemente and Paolo Bartoloni remembered to us that our work is outside our places, and we can get different reactions from that. And this is really what we have to do. We don't want no more to be separate. We are within society, and we are within people. And since we now talk about Anthropocene and the anthropocentric museum, then we really are forced to talk to everybody and not just people who think as we do. And this is right, the foundation of the day of the conference, really listening to instead of saying what we are really convinced of. We are listening to other specialists, other fields, other experts, other points of view, because we think this is the treasure. I feel with most of you being here, being part of a community, we are a team together from our places, from our points of view. And really the challenging point was really to listen to other points of view, being enriched from them. Last point, translation. This is our job, actually, to make a link between museums and society, between museums and the rest of the world, trying to translate in different ways, in different forms, without betraying both museums and society. So I really thank the 3 interventions of this morning, because I think they really suggested to us different ways of looking on our daily job, on our terrifically charming, terrifically difficult, but monstrously wonderful job. And before letting you go to lunch, I really would like to have a brief discussion between all of us and the lecturers that are here. So if Professor Mitchell would like to join here, perhaps we can start to break the ice from a question one to each other, if you don't mind. So perhaps Professor Paolo Bartoloni could make a question on the previous talk taken by Tom Mitchell, and Tom Mitchell could make a question to Paolo Bartoloni from his previous speech. And in the meanwhile, I'll leave you some time to think of what sort of questions or intervention you would like to share here before leaving for lunch. And in the meanwhile, I leave you also the time to see if we have a microphone for the rest of the audience. If not, people are coming here to make their question. Okay?
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. My question is self-serving, of course. So having the opportunity to talk to Tom Mitchell here is a great one for me. And I wanted to ask Tom to perhaps talk a little bit more about what it means by provocation and violence in the context of open spaces or the public sphere. You actually focus your talk very much on enclosed museums, but you have had a keen eye on also work of arts or events that has taken place outside the museum, happenings and activisms and manifestations, rallies, places in restaurants. I think there is a very interesting discussion about the murals or the painting in an Italian restaurant. I think that you discussed in What Do Picture, or it was a picture theory, and a kind of relation with the history of Italy. So I wonder whether you want to say a little bit more about this particular topic.
Yeah, is this on? So.
Does it work? No?
No.
Okay.
This one, perhaps?
Yes, this relation of images and violence has been a problem I've considered for a long time. And the question of what kinds of images offend people, which is very unpredictable. There is no magic formula for anticipating what is going to be offensive to someone. So I've tried to look at some of these and to ask the question, what could the role of the museum be in relation to those things? And this is one place where the museum, as understood as a building that you have to pass through an entrance to get into, maybe pay admission, and the public space, I think you mentioned this, Paolo, you don't have to buy a ticket to get into the plaza. So the Jeff Koons in the plaza risks outraging people who didn't want to see it, but who wanted to see the great Renaissance masterpieces. That's where the provocation perhaps is most vivid. When things impose themselves on a public space that is not walled in or guarded in any way. In the US right now, there's a huge controversy over the statues of Confederate generals. You know, Italy, of course, has its own history of civil wars, only recently a nation in the 19th century. The United States, similarly, the product of a civil war. And so these statues of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate generals, are seen by many people, particularly the black community, as deeply offensive reminders of traitorous rebels, revolutionaries against the United States of America, and as relics of a regime of slavery, which was objectively morally evil. So it's very difficult to know, what do we do with those statues? And so one answer I've proposed is museification. They need to be reframed inside of a space, and I think contemporary artists are the best people to do this, maybe also with people who understand museums. That is, they shouldn't be simply there. They should be framed inside something that explains the relation of past and present, which basically comes to your theme of translation and memory. Memory is such a tricky thing. There are some things we want to forget. We would prefer amnesia. Don't remind me of that. I think that's always dangerous. I'm enough of a Freudian to think if you refuse to remember, the memory will come back to haunt you in some other way. The trauma will express itself in symptoms. And God knows the US is full of symptoms these days, terrible symptoms of a civil war that is not over for many people. So I guess the question I wanted to raise to you is, how can the museum handle, or should it be the institution, one of the institutions, that make it safe to contemplate or possible to contemplate a past you would rather not remember? Could this be one of the things the museum does? Not just preservation of a past that is official. And I think, again, the Medici, we know that the Medici were not nice people. Should our love of this space, the beauty of it, should we completely forget who the Medici were? And how could this beautiful palace be somehow reconciled with the actual, the terrible things the Medici did? Or should we do that? Maybe let's forget about the past and just remember the good things. Is that?
Okay, before the answer, I just remind you that at night, some Medici members could come over here since we are in their house.
No, it's an interesting point, and I think it relates very much to Italy and with Italy in ways that go even beyond what we have discussed today. I don't think there would be the risk of us forgetting what the Medici did, but it's usually kind of celebratory. So what it's mostly kind of produced is a celebration of their power and what they achieved as one of the most enduring political families in Florence. So it's hard, or it's difficult to come across documents which highlight or perhaps talk more about the dark side of the Medici family than the bright side of the Medici family. But we don't need to go that far away in history to confront our wish or will to forget. If you think about fascism, there are many instances in which we as an Italian nation has managed, willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously, to forget about what happened during fascism. Think about fascist art, for instance. Where can one see fascist art? It's very difficult to actually find. If you walk around, you can see fascist architecture. That's all around you, especially in Rome, but not only in Rome, in other smaller places as well. But I'm talking about visual art. I was reminded recently about the very important works that Primo Conti, an Italian futurist and very much part of this area, was a Tuscan, lived in Florence, and there is actually a museum devoted to him in Fiesole. And when we think of Primo Conti, we think of one of the most interesting examples of futurist artists. And when you look at him on Wikipedia or Google or things like that, you'll see very celebratory kind of articulation of his work as one of perhaps of the most humanist futurists. I know very much about futurism and the kind of provocation, the kind of revolutionary, just do away with museum and get away from tradition, and this kind of Maretti himself, and the kind of links between futurism and fascism are quite obvious. But you read about Conti, and there isn't much about it, and yet there is this incredible painting by Conti, where there is a portrait of Mussolini riding a horse followed by the Camicie Nere. It's a kind of celebration of the March on Rome. It's a powerful image. He was a good painter, extremely good painter. Where do you find that painting? It's very difficult to find it. It's very difficult. It's not in the museum, Primo Conti in Fiesole. Why? Why do we have this problem? Why do we have the problem of the Italian colonization in East Africa? Where are the documents talking about that? Where are the images, the photos about the presence of Italy in Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia? So it's a very sensitive question.
Okay, thank you very much. And I wonder if there are some contributions from the public or some questions. Non so se è possibile avere. Perfetto. Allora abbiamo il microfono, se c'è qualche domanda che volete porre, il microfono in fondo sala, alzate la mano. Elisabetta Cioppi, Museo di Storia Naturale.
Sì, io la faccio in italiano, va bene? Quindi, non è una domanda, è una considerazione, anche visto che Valentina mi ha nominato. Sì, appunto, il Museo di Storia Naturale, nel quale abbiamo anche un dente del mastodonte americano di cui ci ha parlato il professor Mitchell. I can try.
L'introduzione
lo so.
non funziona.
Can you talk? Forse perché non sentono. Prova a parlare. Forse
Potete provare la traduzione, se no provo io a parlare in inglese.
Ok, se vuoi ricominciare
Ok?
magari.
That's okay now?
Senti?
Può sentire adesso, professor Mitchell? So,
I'm translating.
I can try to start, but I'm not so easy. So I work in the Natural History Museum of the University of Florence.
Ok, va bene. Comunque,
Che succede?
no, stanno facendo È già settato. Proviamo.
Ok. Allora, dicevo io, non è una domanda, è un po' una suggestione relativamente all'intervento del professor Mitchell. Appunto io lavoro al Museo di Storia Naturale dell'Università di Firenze, in realtà la mia parte è la parte paleontologica. Oh.
No, ok, paleontology, no.
So,
I'm
stop. So, I can start again. So, I'm working in the Natural History Museum of Florence, and I was thinking about the monster. So, our museum is a separate building all in the city. So it's also a separate monster. But what I say that is important, the memory.
That has my driver's license attached to it, so use it.
Also the memory and of history of science, not only of the political, on the history at all, also for other things like history of science. So we have a mammoth, mastodon American in our collection that come from USA from the 1792. So it's important to the relationship between the history of our museum and the history of the first discovery of the mammoth and so on, the Big Bone Lake that we have from Kentucky. So there is also important the memory of the history of science and the history at all. So I think it's not monster in the bad way, in the better things. So in the past I was speaking about museum diversity. So it's okay, the museum diversity. So the monster in USA are very different from our museum in Italy, so that are little and complicated. And so this is, but in English it's more difficult for me. Okay.
Okay, no, wonderful, bravo.
Bravo! I love what you say, and I hope you understand that my use of the word monster didn't mean to suggest that they're all ugly or evil, that there are many beautiful ones, but that they are assemblages of heterogeneous parts, sometimes big, sometimes small. But there is something, and they have a relation of past and present, but also that which in the past seems dead, but we want to bring back to life. I think natural history, even more than art history, involves trying to recover the life that is no longer there. What was the life like for animals? 90% of the life on this planet, the living things, are no longer here. And that's partly natural selection. It's not that human beings are to blame, but today we are to blame. Now, every day, a species vanishes from the world. And natural history is what keeps alive and maybe brings back to life or translates the memory of these lost life forms. So that's why I emphasize natural history in my talk, but not to say these are bad monsters. But they are wonders. They are strange often. They're things we don't see, but that were once part of this planet that dwelt here long before human beings arose. So it's, anyway, thank you for your comment.
Qualche altro contributo o domanda o riflessione da condividere? Qualche mano alzata? Ecco.
All right, for Professor Mitchell, a question, I can talk in English. And I was trying to reflect on that final McDonald's campaign advertisement that we saw with the T-Rex. And I was trying to think what is going to remain of our society in terms of new mythologies, so brands in particular, and maybe this kind of franchising or consumerism trends. So on one side, I think McDonald's, for example, is proposing some sort of an endless return of the identical, so always the same French fries, always the same hamburger, all over the world, so everybody can stay relaxed and be sure that in that particular museum, in several iterations all around the world, the same French fry will be served. So no panicking, and I can also avoid eating, I don't know, that strange Indian food that they offer me at the corner because I can go into the temple. On the other side, instead, brands are just like little species or specimens that are changing little by little in time. It's just like once I saw, the other one chart that you presented to us, the evolution of the sneaker. So little steps, baby steps from the first Nike Air Jordan, 94 to the latest, and then retro vintage return. So on one side, you have this incremental specimen that are evolving of the same sneaker, of the same, Rolex watch. On the other side, the endless return of the identical. And in the middle, you have the museification of maybe the Jeff Koons ordinary objects. So I was wondering, what's the future of our society in terms of remembering the things that we associate with in order to search for our identity, and how an endless return of the identical could be satisfying in terms of immobility, contrasted with the incremental changes of a specimen of sneakers.
I think that's too difficult a question.
That's why I was posing that to you.
No, it's very, very interesting. So let me just see if I understand you. You want to understand the contrast between the step-by-step evolution of past to present as a kind of continuous narrative, and then the sudden awakening where past and present, there's a leaping over from past to the present?
Something in the middle. I was thinking about the very first speaker talking about the little things from the peasant or the countryside world. So we try to put them in museums because the avalanche of urbanization is destroying them. On the other side, I'm thinking about the future of this society, the consumerist one. Will we be, in the end, in a museum, and in which kind of scenario? The one of the endless return of one single food, for example, or the other scenario in which people are lining up outside of a Mac retailer, Apple retailer, to buy the latest phone that is actually the same as the previous one with another number on top. So I was trying to understand that, if there is a future for our society in terms of museification of our objects of desire.
Yeah. Well, I hope there's a future for both kinds, but I am more concerned, I think, or more anxious about the tendency to commercialize and commodify the museum. It's now the case, I think this must be true in Italy as it is in the United States, that the museum store has become almost as important with its copies and replicas as the original artworks, and that my McDonald's commercial, I think it was a brilliant illustration of the necessary relation between museums and another form of the monstrous, namely the monetary. That museums can't survive without money. But where does the money come from? Does it come from the public, which asserts that the museum is a public good? This is why, in the golden age of American museums, it was regarded as a national interest, either from big philanthropy or from the state, to support the commemoration of the past, both for its glory, but also for not so glorious things. But now museums really rely much more on the money that's brought in by the patrons, turning themselves into mass media, competing with shopping malls, sports events, and theaters. So what is sacrificed when that happens? The biggest thing that was sacrificed in American museums was their purpose as research institutions. The Field Museum of Natural History used to be a major place for anthropologists and biologists to gather. Now it's for display professionals. It focuses on the exhibitionary complex and not on the research side of the museum, which I suppose has been handed off to professors like Paolo and me. But it should be, I think, part of the mission of those museums, which requires something other than the exhibitionary value to sustain the museum. I don't know, Paolo, do you want to comment?
Well, yeah, I think the spectacularization that you're talking about is quite pervasive, and you know, sometimes it's ethical as well. There is an element of ethical problems that I suppose it's just emerging as well. I was reading recently about Teatro della Scala, perhaps accepting or considering a donation from Saudi Arabia, I believe, and what that might mean. So I think that, as you said, museums and other cultural institutions are faced with very important questions about the way of existing and continuing to exist and dealing with important issues, sensitive issues. What I believe is happening, but it's very difficult to know how these might develop. What I find fascinating about, for instance, what's happening in Florence, and I'm not sure whether that will continue, because I'm sure that institutions like MUS.E or even the stesso comune plays under incredible pressure about how they go about promoting the heritage, and what has been done over the years is very courageous, but I don't think it's also particularly kind of innocent or, you know, it might have risks. There is a great element of risks embedded in this kind of situation, which I find quite interesting and instructive, that a city of Florence is taking risks. I've been told time and time again, why? Why does the city of Florence need to do that? They don't need to. What's the point? Just leave it as it is. People will continue to flow. People will continue to go to Florence. That's what they want. So why? And the question why, I think it's very important. And it's not just about experiencing the Renaissance as you imagine it, but experiences it in a context which perhaps is not that of the museum, but in a sense is a museification too. It's perhaps less obvious that there is an act of museification taking place outside the museum, but it is an operation, a deliberate curatorial operations that are creating another space for engagement. And this space for engagement is really, to me at least, is inviting us to change a way in which we deal with art, in which we speak about art, the language that we use to validate, or the contrary, art. And I think this movement is very exciting. Well, in fact, it will be allowed to continue. It's another matter. I suppose it depends on the kind of institution that is at the helm of the promotion of heritage in Florence or any other city. But I think Florence is one of the few cities, I cannot think Rome, for instance, or Venice, or any other of the cities that have tried to do something a little bit different, because when you ask yourself why, that question doesn't have direct answers. And you said, well, perhaps we shouldn't, or perhaps we should continue, because, I mean, what I suppose you have done, the reactions that you got from not only tourists, and some of the tourists were quite exciting actually, and especially Americans, that all of a sudden next to Michelangelo's David, they had one of their artists, Jeff Koons, American. Well, he's next to David. Wow, that's great. Here we are in Piazza della Signoria, and there is an American artist exhibiting on Dario, temporary of course, but still. So you have the tourist reaction sometimes is kind of, no, wow, that's great, recognition. And the Florentines that, and the other tourists from Italy that are kind of taken aback, but at the same time looking at it different. It's not just about looking at it differently. It's about thinking about themselves differently. And that's what, it's the notion of identity that you touch there. And when you, of course, when you touch identity, you entered into a very difficult area. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about sociology, it's about philosophy, it's about psychology of the individual inhabiting a place. The notion of belonging that really is calling to questions. Exactly. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, giving sense to culture and moving forward, could be really the answer to that's why we don't just leave the postcard of Florence like this. And other questions or contributions? I would say the last one or maximum one more, and then we leave you for lunch.
Thank you for your fascinating views on museums and society. There should be a lot to talk about. But I have a question for Tom Mitchell. You mentioned this double connotation of a monster being both the item kept, the object in the collection, and also the monster as the building itself. But then you moved to this development of museums through centuries, and how from these elite places of education they have become a blockbuster display. So I was wondering if there's a relationship that, rather whether this development sets also the degree of monstrosity in a way where it comes to museums, whether museums today are more monstrous than museums 2 centuries back, for example. And yeah, this would be the question.
So the question is whether museums are more monstrous today than they used to be?
Yes.
I don't know.
Since you mentioned this development and change
I think that maybe they are different kinds. They're of course, I was giving a very simplified version of the history of museums because there are so many different kinds and they have such different relations to the past themselves. This is why my concluding suggestion was that there be a museum of museums, a meta-museum, which would try to gather, since you couldn't have them all physically, you would have to miniaturize them. And so you would have models of the Smithsonian and the British Museum and the Uffizi. It would be like that Borges short story in which the entire empire of China, you make a map that is as big as China. But this would all be miniaturized, probably could be done with digitization, so that you could map out in space and time the entire potential, the entire past, as well as possible futures for what human beings have done under the name of the museum as a place to store, a medium for transmission of knowledge, production of knowledge, and then the display, the demonstration of the results of knowledge. So in order to answer your question, we would have to have such a museum. That's why it's too difficult
I agree.
to answer now. But it's not too difficult to imagine what it would be like. So that would be my hope. I don't have a master narrative, except these simple ones. In America, there is one master narrative about art museums that went from modernism, when there was an impulse to destroy the museum without walls. Of course, Trotsky and the Russian avant-garde wanted to destroy the museum and to break down all the walls. No more buildings. The museum must move out into the world, and the world must move into it. It was a very radical and strange moment. Then in the United States, after really starting around 1960, the museum became the enemy in a different way for artists. They had to produce what was called institutional critique. So conceptual art arrived to produce satire, parody of the museum, objects that said, you would get a canvas and then you would have writing on it. This is a work of art. Trust me. It may not look like a painting, but it is a work of art. And you know the artists I'm talking about who did this. Institutional critique had to inhabit the space. At the same time, it seemed to sometimes make fun of it, parody it, but then it settled down and it became a kind of alien resident within the museum. So there are numerous histories, I think, depending upon the kind of museum. Some of them are museums of trauma, where that which we would write not to remember, it's painful to remember, but for some reason we think it's necessary. It's not about pleasure, it's about facing up to what we have done. So that's a totally different kind of history. In my meta museum, all of these different kinds would be there. Natural history would be there with a very important relation to the history of empire. Because, as you know, if you've been to Berlin, you know that Germany never had an empire like France, but it did have a relation to the world's art and relics, and France particularly looted the whole Mediterranean world. Greece was the object of looting, India. So there is a whole past about colonization, theft, loot, bringing these relics, including sometimes human relics. People were brought back. We were just looking at the Medici Chapel, and I was asking Francesco Gori, my colleague here, why in front of the Medici family is there a black man standing there? He's the biggest figure in the whole entourage, and he's there to show the power of the Medicis, that they had a slave who was handsome, young, strong. He's carrying the bow, the weapon. He's the weapon bearer. So that's the history of empire, which not only brings back objects for display, but brings back humans as servants. Again, in America, this would be the history of the Civil War and the defeat of the South, where human chattel slavery was the law of the land. That was the state, the Confederate States of America. All those relics, what do we do with them? Some people want to abolish and forget them. I think, no, that's a mistake. They have to, but all of this will be in the Meta Museum, which you are helping me imagine.
Thank you.
Okay, some more questions, or shall we? No. Okay, one more. Okay, last one in the middle. Marco Turini, Santa Maria Novella. We know each other. I mean, everyone. We are a community, actually. So.
Hello, just the last question, very quick. To Professor Mitchell, you talk about museum and politics, how it's related with nationalism, and for instance, if you make an example like British Museum, which is a result of colonization of other territories. I think it's difficult to think about museums separate from politics. But do you think that in the next future, can we completely separate museum from politics? Do you think it's possible?
No, I don't. I think that must be obvious. There is an idea of the museum which is determined to purify it of any kind of contamination by politics or society or commerce. And it's epitomized in the color white, or the absence of color. So the white cube, the white walls, and I was so interested when Paolo was showing Michelangelo's great David statue, the whiteness of sculpture. I think everybody knows that ancient Greek sculpture was not white. It was not pure white marble. It was painted. And when they're repainted, or they're found with the original paint on them, it's a little bit shocking, because there is a desire to have our art be pure and not have anything to do with politics, to be a kind of refuge from the world. And I'm not totally unsympathetic to that. Sometimes you want to be free of the world, to escape from it, and that's one thing the museum does for you. But I think it's a temporary escape. It's a little bit like a refuge. And those white Greek statues and the Roman copies, it would be interesting, I think, as an experiment to repaint them, or repaint copies of them, so people could see them. They'd be like department store mannequins, very lifelike, too lifelike. It's as if we want the pure white objects. They're sort of like ghosts of the past. Only the form remains, but the fleshly color and the color of life is gone from them. And that is, for some reason, that's what we want, or some of us want. I know I find it disturbing when I see these statues painted. And the David covered with tattoos is, it's pretty shocking, but maybe a good shock.
There was also another David by the same, curators, Sergio Lisaliti, in that case Barzagli, I think. This time was fallen and black. There was life-size, not tattooed, but there was black and lie down in Piazza della Repubblica. It's another interesting way of, I suppose, employing David and employing an iconic figure of the Italian Renaissance to come to terms with migration and the horror of migrants dying time and time again on the shores of Italy.
Well, I just wanted to say a word since you mentioned me. You are talking about another black thing, which was a black person, the Black David, black and white. So we're focusing on black and white. So I was wondering, what power is the display of? Because you asked me what was the meaning of a black man in the foreground. I said that's a symbol of power. Then I was reflecting after your presentation as well. It is the power of domestication, I guess. Civilization, what we call in general civilization, is a great enterprise of domestication of instincts. Because when I was looking at the film of the commercial of the skeleton of the dinosaur, domesticated by civilization, and civilization at some point turns to cross the line and to transform treasures into junk, into garbage, as well as our museums. Great treasures, but with junk food, and in some ways we can say junk people, but I don't want to judge the people. Because when a society becomes so vast and so anonymous, it turns into junk very easily. I turn myself into junk very easily when I'm part of the crowd. Well, that's it.
And no doubt, I don't know, is there a museum of junk? There must be one somewhere,
We'll
because
check.
there's a
We'll
museum of
check.
everything.
Or we'll do it. We'll check or we'll do it.
But when we think about archaeological museums, for instance, usually what they are, for instance, in the American Southwest, if you go to the relics of Native American civilizations or communities, what you find is what has been gathered from the trash heap. So today's garbage is tomorrow's object of museification. But who is going to be around when we completely fill the world? When the world, right now in the northern Pacific Ocean, there is a new island of plastic trash swirling. It's bigger than the state of New Jersey. And I often think about museums. That's why I mentioned the anecdote of the alien visitor, that I think it's important, just as a thought experiment, to imagine a future in which we are gone. I mean, Darwin's law says nothing lasts forever, no life form. And we are a life form that is doing a good job of destroying our habitat. We're the only creature that will be responsible for its own extinction. Previous animal groups it hasn't been their fault. The dinosaurs were perfectly well adapted, but for various reasons they died out. Human beings, on the other hand, this is why it's so important for us to have a museum of the future in which we look back on our own civilization and ask, why did it come to an end? What was so you have to imagine the alien visitor. Think of yourself as from outer space coming to visit this planet when all of us are gone. What would that museum look like?
Bene, allora un ultimo applauso. Con queste riflessioni importanti appunto in una giornata speciale come oggi ci lasciamo per il pranzo, sono le 13:53, io cercherei se siete d'accordo, di trovarci qui alle 14:40, quindi una cinquantina di minuti, se ce la facciamo. Il programma del pomeriggio è ancora più denso, con appunto filosofi, pedagogisti, sociologi, curatori ed economisti, quindi 14:40 qui con tutti pronti.